Back in those days, of course, we had just the outhouse, we didn't have any indoor plumbing. And we'd probably take a couple baths in the winter. Of course, everybody smelled alike. Didn't make much difference. Anyway, when we were gonna get company, I had uncle and aunt, well, I had a couple of them that lived in the cities, but I remember we had this one aunt, and of course, we had the outhouse, and we didn't have toilet paper as such. We used the old Sears Roebuck catalog, the Montgomery Ward catalog. Except when Aunt Mary was gonna come, and then Mom would pick up a roll of toilet tissue and put it down there. But we were instructed not to use that. You know, if you did, just use one sheet. That's funny. So Aunt Mary would have her toilet tissue when she came.
That's really interesting. Wow. I wouldn't even have thought to ask about that.
Well, just little crazy things, I guess, and you think of now, you think, boy, that was really something, but that's all she could afford, my mom. But she was a good cook because she, you know, we raised our own potatoes and we had our own meat, and she baked her own bread, and we'd even haul wheat in and have flour made from her own grain at times. Not always, she mostly bought some flour, but we did have flour made. I don't remember my mom ever driving the car. I think she had at one time maybe tried it, but I never remember her driving the car, so she wouldn't have been able to go in and get anything on her own. I remember an interesting event, sort of relative to that. It had to do with my grandma and my Aunt Ann. And my Aunt Ann told me about that in later years. I had two uncles that had moved to Milwaukee. In fact, they married women from down there, but this is before that. And they were sort of rowdy, and they'd gotten themselves into a little trouble, and so Grandma had gotten a phone call, Grandma Sarah, and the guy at the, I guess the telegraph came to the railroad station or whatever, and he called my grandma and told her about this telegram, and it was my two uncles that had sent this thing, and they needed some money for something. And he started reading it, and Grandma said, "Don't bother," she says, "I'll come in and get it." Well, she didn't drive. And my Aunt Annie was the youngest in the family. She was probably 13 years old, 14 years old. Grandpa wasn't around, and she didn't want Grandpa to know about this anyway. So they went down and they rolled the car out of the garage because Ann had never driven before. And they got the car out, and she didn't know how to shift. And she says she started the car in a low gear and drove it all the way to Long Prairie that way to get this telegram. And they parked, you know, a ways away. They didn't, I don't know how far, but anyway, they got the telegram. Then she drove it back home again. I always thought that was interesting. Grandma's trying to protect her sons, Eddie and Joseph. And then another story, my Uncle Benny then, he played a violin. I don't know where he learned to play the violin or the fiddle or whatever. But when he got a little older then he would want to go and play for some dances, you know, or join someone. And so Grandpa didn't approve of that. And Benny knew that. So he used to tie a rope around the violin and let it down through the window, upstairs window, and then he'd go down the steps and then he'd get his violin, he'd go off and play. Well, he did this one time, and Uncle Benny made it down the steps, and he came around the house to get his violin, and there was Grandpa, and he handed it to him. You know, I don't think those are interesting little tidbits. So he didn't make it that night. But you can imagine with 7 rambunctious boys and maybe 1 or 2 of the girls, he had quite a time keeping them in line. And they said every time he used to have more evangelists that would come around and preach in the churches, and he'd always invite them to stay at his place. And then of course they'd work the kids over. They rebelled against that.
My grandpa and grandma talked about the phone, the phone system being more of a, like you could tell when people were listening in and the party.
Oh yeah, well you were on a party line, so the way they communicated, you didn't do long distance calling hardly ever at that time. But they had, I think on our particular line over there, we had like 25 people on the same line.
Very much so.
So if somebody called,
I will.
you know, everybody'd run to their phone to see what's going on, and they'd listen. And then they'd, for example, my grandma's ring was a long and a short and a long. And ours was a short and a long and a short and a long. So Mom and Grandma, they'd, you know, talk together quite regularly. And anyway, they tried to get around this, people calling, so they'd call each other and then they'd have a little chat together and they'd say goodbye, and then they'd stand there and listen to everybody hang. You could hear when they were hanging up. And then when everybody had hung up, then they'd start talking again. But I suppose others learned that trick too. But everybody was on this, you know, you could pick it up anytime it rang and you'd hear the conversation. And then we had what we called the Gordon Central. And that was ran out of a home over here where what's her name? Johnson? Well, it's Bill Johnson's place, but it's right on 27. And they'd run the Gordon Central, so if you wanted to call somebody over in the Osakis line, then you'd call Gordon Central, and then they could connect you over on the Osakis line. But you had to go through Gordon Central to make the connect. And then, of course, after Phil and Irene were married, then my dad and Phil, they ran their own private telephone line across the neighbor's field, so they had their own phone. And I am not, something tells me that for a couple of years or whatever, that Phil and Irene had no other phone except that one, I think. I always remember we had a phone, but I think there was a time we had two telephones. One in the kitchen and one in the pantry. The one in the pantry was to call Irene. And you hardly ever would call a long distance, and it was very expensive if you did. Now we take our cell phones on and we call any place in the world. Unbelievable. Ina talks to her sisters in Arizona and Washington a couple times a week, or her sister Elaine up in Fergus Falls a couple times a day, it seems like. It's amazing communications. And of course Nadine, she talks to her every day. It's really nice. That's for sure. And we even get to talk to Jonah. Oh, yeah.
That's history before.
Well, she's talking about men's fellowship. Did you ever hear about that? We had an organization in this community called Christian Men's Fellowship, and the members of that were from various churches in the community, might say evangelical, gospel preaching churches, and we had men who were part of that who came as far as down as from Hewitt, for example, of course Alexandria, Sauk Center, Long Prairie, Sauk Center, and points in between. And we get together once a month for our men's fellowship. We go to the different churches. But then they decided to sponsor a radio program. So they, they make contributions and bought time on KWAD Wadena, and we put a program on then every Sunday morning. And Phil and Orville and Lauren and I, we had a quartet. So we were the music every Sunday morning. So we'd get together every week and put a program together. And we'd have a pastor from one or the other of the churches that would speak, but we would always do the music on there. We've done that for 12 years, or 11 or 12 years. And I know it's the pianist. So we'd go over, most of the time we'd go over to Phil and Irene's and we'd put the program together right there. Once in a while we do it someplace else. For example, we put a program on up at Rose City, and then we'd put a program together in front of the people who were supporting us so they could see how it would go. We always had the same theme song every Sunday. Blessed tidings of joy we proclaim to the world. Salvation through Christ, Jesus our Lord. And then we'd have a song we'd sing, a short message, and then we'd close it off. But that's quite a commitment to do that every Sunday, get a program together. We had Freddie Walters, who was a Free Methodist pastor, and he had a good deep bass voice, and he was the announcer for most of those years, and then he moved away, and then Phil took over and done that. And Rick and Gary, particularly, and Ron, they would lay upstairs over the heat register and they'd listen to us down there, putting the program together. In fact, there's a fellow in Long Prairie, He said, Peterson. His dad's name was Richard Peterson. And we run into him every once in a while, but he's an organist at the Baptist Church in Long Prairie. But he tells me, he says, well, the reason I learned to play the piano or organ, he said, is because my dad always said it was hard to come up with a accompanist or for the men's fellowship, so he got me to take lessons, etc. But he said that was the main reason I learned to play in the first place. Of course, he's a very good musician. Yeah, so. And then once in a while we go out to one of these churches on a Sunday evening and put on the service, put on a program. We had different pastors. Pastor Hank Cavley was here for a couple of those years, and others also who would participate. So we got to know a lot of preachers around the community, lots of Christian men. So when we were doing that, we, it took time too. Although we didn't have a lot of practice times, we'd sung so much, but we'd brush up on a song and then we'd use it. But we always sang the theme song. We didn't use the recording. Beginning to end.
So did you go into? Did you pre-record it and then play it, and then it was?
Yeah,
played?
we pre-recorded the service and then got it to the station.
Where did you do the pre-recording?
We had a recorder.
In a house, sometimes at your folks.
Yeah.
Irene's and
Different places,
different places, yeah.
but mostly, I would say mostly was over at Phil and Irene's house. And the kids were always good. Never had to start over that I ever remember. Yeah. I remember one time we put on a service up at the Nazarene Church up in Hewitt. They had a pastor up there by the name of Reverend Longenecker. Interesting name. And boy, we had a really good spirit of things going on there. And anyway, we saw them later, and his wife, and she said that that was the beginning of a little revival that they had in that church. Was, us coming there and presenting our program. So, different things like that. Responses. But then that all shut down when we moved to Fergus Falls. And I think they kept on for a little while after that, because I think Dave Walters came on and sang in the quartet after I left. But I don't think it was for very long that they kept it up. So that was an interesting time. I think I told you everything I know.
Is that your sister's grave? Yeah. Orville sang, and she mentioned that.
Mm.
Picture of my little sister's casket.
And Orville put his hand on there and sang, he said. They said,
I'm not sure why this is here, Ina.
here's the label. But it's scripture. the label.
Oh, it's a little thing that was distributed here
Mm-hmm.
by the Christian Men's Fellowship
Little Bible.
for Catholics. Words of comfort for the Catholics. I don't remember that at all.
It's your sister. Do you remember that at all?
No, she died before. She died as a baby. But she's buried up at Long Bridge. And we go up there and visit her gravesite occasionally. Her name was Adeline.
Adeline Olga, wasn't it?
And she was between Orville and Lorne. And they were only a couple of years apart, so. Yeah.
But Orville said he remembered singing for her little funeral. I remember him saying that.
I'm afraid not, Ina. He wouldn't have hardly been a year old yet.
What year did she die?
I don't think he was singing quite that early.
Well, you don't know what year she died. I
Well,
don't know.
she was born between Orville and Lorne, and they were only 2 years apart.
I thought it was after those two.
I know, he sang for a little funeral or something, and they talked about that. And I remember they said he put his hand on the little casket and sang, I think it was Jesus Loves Me. And he was just a little tank at that time. So they were singers. My mother was a singer. And in the early years, they went to Long Bridge Church. And my mother was in a mixed quartet there, and they sang together for quite a few years. She was the alto. Emma Wold was the soprano. Bill Olson was the second bass, and Helmer Plan was the baritone. And I think I heard him sing one time. I have a faint memory of that. You just never know how far back you can remember something. You know, what's your earliest memory? So I told you about my grandpa coming over to our house. Well, I think I figured that I could not have been quite 4 years old at that time. So I have that memory. And that's a clear memory, you know. But I have nothing I come up with before that I could remember. But I know that. I know when my grandpa died, and you know, I know how old I was at that time, so. And the folks would take us to these different Christmas programs, and then they usually have a time when, in those days, they'd say, well, if there's anybody in the audience that has something to share, well, you know, now's the time for them, and they'd always push us to do something. So we got into that. And of course, even Little Bethel had a choir in the early days. So it's kind of, you know, it's kind of nice that we had the Little Bethel Cemetery, because Orville always took an interest in that, and if there were work days or things like that, or I drove by yesterday coming from Sauk Center, and I looked up there, and we have a little plaque up there, and Orville and I put that back up after we put the new shingles on. Oh, hey, that's one of the last things we done together. But he was always interested in the little church. And keeping that cemetery up, and that's why I'm so happy that, you know, Orville and Norma, you know, have chosen to have places there, because we need people to be interested in and aware of that, and in fact, next Bethel Day, Memorial Day, I've asked the guys to put on the program from the Larson side. So that'll be interesting. Stimulate the interest.
The interest in keeping that little church in the consciousness, where does that stem from? What's the...
Well, it was one of the first churches in the Lutheran Brethren, early churches. That's probably the third or fourth church ever that was an LB church. And that was an LB church, you know. Elam is not an LB church, that's an independent one. E.M. Brown was the pastor. He served Elam and Little Bethel. And so it had its good early years. Of course, you had Grandpa Johnson, his 12 kids, you know. You had, you know, they didn't all weren't in the age at the same time. But I went to church there as a kid. I probably was the only one at one time. I was in the Sunday school. I still remember my little old pink Sunday paper. And we have, if you ever noticed, the bench is still there, an old wooden plank bench. That was my classroom. We'll go sit back in the corner of that. But then we had others, you know, that they started dropping out because it was just the churches couldn't close, and they went and found other places. And finally closed down. But they were one of the first. There's some pretty early gravestones there. And we've had, you know, a couple, 3 burials just lately up there. We have tried to improve the facility, you know, just to keep it restored. And we have additional land back there on the north side of the church that could be cleared out, and we could have a lot of graves in there. We still have at least 40 sites on the present graveyard. So it's really a beautiful spot up there. And you know, sometimes some people have a hard time finding a grave spot. And sometimes if they find one, it gets very, very expensive. So if you could connect up some way to that graveyard, you could have a pretty inexpensive gravesite. Of course, Elam is, you know, pretty much the same way. And we have additional land up there too for 100 more graves if we need it. But it's something we've been able to keep up, and we've had people who have been willing to contribute to it. We've been, you know, trying to do the work up there and build up the fund. People have been generous. We never have a whole lot of money, but we always have enough so we know we make it, you know. More and more, we're trying to build up a fund so at one time I had hoped that we could have enough so that we'd have a fund large enough so that earnings would pay for the yearly upkeep, but of course, you know, with interest earnings so low right now that it hardly pays to put money in the bank. But we have a few thousand put away, and then we get in more than enough every year, it seems like. And it's kind of fun to keep that contact. We still have people who come regularly and seem to enjoy the day, and we need to keep stimulating that interest. But I don't think Orville and Norma ever missed one of our celebrations that I remember.
I was interested in your take on. So you were born in 30, or what year were you born?
1930.
30. Okay. So World War II happens. What for you? What awareness was there, and what was the, as far as your family, did anything change with?
Well, of course, Orville was not eligible to serve in the army, and my dad had ulcers, and we had to farm, and Lorne got exception. Because of that, he desperately wanted to enlist in the army, but somebody had to run the farm. I remember many a time sitting by the table, and he'd be talking about, you know, that he wanted to join the army. Dad would, you know, say, well, I have to have someone to run the farm and to do the work. I remember, you know, Pearl Harbor, of course, and I remember a lot of young men at that time going away to war. In fact, if you ever go by Longbridge Church on Memorial Day, you'll see there are, I think, 60-some flags out there. Those are people who served in the armed forces, you know. There's really a lot of them. I remember my cousin, Norman Buin, for example, going away. He was a bachelor, and my dad was painting the buildings that he was renting. In fact, it was the farm that I was born on, and where they lived before they bought the farm that they lived on all their lives after that. And he went away into the service. He joined the Marines, Norman did. And he went over to the South Pacific. And he was killed in the first battle, the Battle of Tarawa. And I can't remember, his dad had died, Norman's dad, and she was remarried, but his oldest sister was Mrs. Ernest Boyer, Edna. And I remember we were getting ready to go down to Ernest and Annie Peterson's for Christmas Eve, and we get this call, and that was the notification that Norman had been killed. So they had my dad's telephone number as a contact because the Boyers didn't have a phone. So my dad had to deliver the message that Christmas Eve to Edna that her brother had been killed in the Battle of Tarawa in the South Pacific. But we had others. I haven't thought about it so much, but Lloyd Price was a Navy man, and he never came back. We had lots of neighbor boys that went into the service, and some of them were wounded, and I can't write offhand. I remember we had Bob George, of course, who was captured by the Germans and spent quite a bit of time in a German prison camp. Came back and became the community electrician. He also was a county commissioner. We had the Johnsons, Albert Johnsons, and all of their boys were in the service. And, you know, Byron and Sidney was the oldest, and Byron, and then Charles and Raymond, who was my age, and then James. James is the only one living anymore. And they all went into the service. Their cousin Wallace, they actually lived in the same house in the early years. Raymond Bierstrom was in the service, and, you know. So yeah, we were well aware of what was going on. We watched the news, but we couldn't watch it like we do today. But we had the radio. Got most of our news on the radio. So we kept up with it. I recall there was a time when you had Germany and invading and taking over France and getting down into Italy. Well, of course, Italy joined forces with them. They went over to England, or tried to take over England. They went over and took over Poland and all those countries. And then they attacked Pearl Harbor. And of course, the whole thought was that they were going to attack the United States. And the Japanese joined them there. So you wondered, and you really didn't understand the full impact of what that could be, but a little change here and a little change there, and we could have had a whole different situation if they would have ever been successful in declaring war and conquering these countries. And then of course we've had wars ever since, it seems like. We had the Korean War, and I was in and out of the service before the war started. And I was in the reserve, but I never got called to active duty. But we also knew, you know, what could happen there. The division that I was with, the 3rd Infantry Division, was one of the first ones to encounter the enemy over there in Korea. Many of my friends went into war, and I don't know how many made it and how many didn't. I was in the medical battalion. Then we had the Vietnam War, you know, and there's been wars here and there ever since. Could be Iraq, or could be Afghanistan, or who knows where. And you always think of this, the Bible says there's going to be wars and rumors of war. Well, we've had that as long as I've lived. Seems like. And you become more and more conscious of the brevity of life, you know. I think when you're over 80 years old, you know, you don't have much time left. Eternity is just around the corner. could be for any of us, but the reality of that sets in. And that's what I used to enjoy so much talking to Orville, because he was so conscious of that. And we talked about, you know, how good it is to have things right with the Lord, and we talk about his favorite song a lot, Blessed Assurance, how good it is to know that whatever comes, we're ready to go. And there's an eternity out there. And, you know, as individuals, we think we're the center of the world, so everything has to revolve around us. And we forget that we're hardly a speck in humanity. But I've been more and more conscious of the fact of what a great universe we have. I mean, you know, what a great God we are. He's sovereign over the whole universe. And I just heard this, you know, remark made about, for example, the sun, the size of the sun in comparison to the earth. I think he said it would take 1,300,000 Earths to make one sun. And then out there in the universe someplace, there's another whatever. That is 300,000 times the size of the sun. And then to know that there are tens of thousands of satellites that all have tens of thousands of stars, and they have not found the end of the universe yet. I think there's a God out there that cares about me. Isn't that amazing? And who says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. I enjoy when I get a chance to talk to someone, you know, and there are many opportunities like that. I was going to get my car, thought I had a major problem with my car. Sounded like the transmission was ready to fall out of it. I had an appointment yesterday and I took it down, and mechanic had out and back, he was looking at it, and I was talking to a fellow up there. He was a Catholic fellow, but really nice young man, and we got to talking about those things. And what a great God we have, and what a tremendous universe. And then he happened to be Catholic background, and you know, I said, you know, it really doesn't make a difference what denomination we are. The real important thing is what kind of a relationship do we have with the God of the universe. You know, and I really witnessed to him and laid it on the line. We just sat there conversationally. God opens up opportunities like that. I go up to Alec and I sit in the mall up there, and someone would be sitting there, and, you know, and usually another old guy like me, and we'll start talking about things, and first thing you know, we're talking about spiritual things. I'll tell them about one of my old experiences of how you know, I had quadruple bypass, and how the doctors had told my doctor I shouldn't have really lived through that because it was a rather severe situation. And I had I think a psychiatrist, would have been his title, used to come around every day and ask me on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your anxiety level today? I said, I don't have any anxiety. Oh, you must have a little anxiety. Nope, not a bit. Every day the same thing. And I was there a couple, 3 days before they could get me in. And then afterwards, a couple of days, and The last day he came in and he said to me, "You're an amazing man." Now this guy's doing this all the time, you know. I said, "No, I'm not an amazing man." I said, "I have an amazing God." And so I share that with people, you know, that or something else. Try to do it conversationally. Plant the seed. And I go with a prayer in my heart to say, well, I'm going to, you know, if I go to the mall today, if you have someone that you want me to talk to, you just set them down by me and open it up and we can have a little talk. And it's really fun. You know, I really enjoy that, having that opportunity. I was visiting with my farmer friend, the one that runs the land here. He's a Catholic fellow, and we met in West Union because it was a time last year, I think, in March or April. He usually pays me about that time, and then we got to talking about some spiritual things. I can't remember how it ever led into it, but I just talked to him, got in on the subject of how good it is to not worry about the future, to know that whatever happens, that God will take care of you, and how you can know that. Just like yesterday, I was quoting Bible verses to this fellow. I said, you know, but you know, do it conversationally, not as though you're trying to preach to him. Because I always think this, that I know that the Bible says that if you're not a Christian, it says that the wicked, that's unsaved, really. Not have bad, evil people necessarily. They're like they're like the troubled seas. They cannot rest. So if I can say something and talk to them about the rest I have, I know that's something they need. I don't have to wonder about it. And maybe you can talk to them and share something, you know, that will help them to come to understand, or give you another day to witness to. So I think that's my biggest responsibility now. Some days I get that opportunity and other times I don't. I don't worry about it. You get to the point where, you know, where you visit with the Lord every day and often. Talk to him about the simple everyday things. I talked to Pastor Quam one time. I said, you know, I even talk to the Lord about some little things that you may think it's foolish, but I know. We were going down to the 17th of May celebration down at Padua. They have a big meal down there. And I said, I even talked to the Lord about finding a parking place for me, that's because I had, you know, I was hurting a lot and whatnot. And would you believe we came driving to Padua and there were cars all over the place, and just as we came there, a car right in front pulled out, and I said, see there? That's our parking place. Now can you believe that God would be concerned about that? If it's not there, I just figure he wants me to walk a little farther. But I think we forget about the sovereign God we have, and how he loves us and he cares about us much more than anyone else could ever care. And we can just leave all our cares with him. I know in my work as president of Lutheran Brethren Homes, and I had multitudes of challenges. We'd done quite a bit of building, and we put the project together from the ground up, you know? And they were fairly substantial. I'd have, well, I don't know, 700-800 people working for me in 3 different states, different locations. Sometimes we stuck our neck out pretty far, and you wonder if you're going to make it. And I just say, well, Lord, I've left this work in your hands. I've just left it up to you to lead us, so you must have an answer for this. I may not have it, but you do. And I could find comfort in that. And we ministered to lots of people. Kind of exciting when you see someone over 100 years old come to know the Lord. You know? Lots of people who had religion, but they never had a personal relationship with the Lord. One fellow told me that he was a Christian because he played the organ in the church for 40 years. You know, or others, I taught Sunday school or whatnot. But that's what you wanted to know, what they were hinging their faith on. And it wasn't only the residents, but I had a chance to witness to a lot of employees. Had employees tell me, you know, you're the one that showed me the way. That was good. We ran Christian homes, that was the emphasis. We had a little sign down, plaque on the wall down at Little Bethel Church. Never forgot it. I don't know whatever happened to it, but it had this little saying, only one life will soon be passed, only what's done for Christ will last. Just think about that, put it in the right context, and read the Bible a lot. Read the book of Romans regularly. Read the 8th chapter of Romans every day.
Was that one of your favorites too?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's sort of the key to the Bible. Key to the Bible. I'll have to admit, I haven't read it every day, but I read it many times. And we've just gone through the Bible study we have on the radio and just completed the book of Romans again. Been in it for weeks, every day. Amazing. This guy said, if you read the book of Romans every day, it only takes about an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half. If everybody would do that for 6 months, this would be a different world we live in. Martin Luther was, you know, so strong on the book of Romans and being in the book. And I think it's important that we try to spend time in the Word regularly, every day. There are some people who don't look in the Bible between Sundays. Many of them who don't do it then. I was looking in my library the other day, When I was looking at the Bible of a guy who was in church last Sunday, I thought, I ought to give him a new Bible. And I have over 30 Bibles in my library. Beside my iPhone and all of that. Well, I've got, you know, the good Bibles, and some of them are, you know, they're leather bound study Bibles. I got a lot of them, and I've given a lot of them away. Yeah, good to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoy going over and sitting there reading, and of course I go to sleep every once in a while. Then I'll wake up and my book may have fallen out of my hand. And I spend a lot of time on the computer too, looking up. Oh, there's thousands of sermons, good stuff in there. I got that on my iPhone too. I've got this fellow by the name of Les Feldick. He's a rancher from Oklahoma, and he knows his Bible inside out. That's the one we listen to 8 o'clock every weekday morning. I've got all of his Bible studies on my iPhone also. And so I can just plug in my earphones, listen to them. I can also read them, except the print is pretty small. I don't know if I could get it on an iPad or not. I've been wondering about that. It'd be a lot easier to read.
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you could.
Yeah, I gotta check that out.
Well, we've been at it for a while.
Yeah, you betcha. Almost 2 hours.
Almost 3.
Almost 3 hours? Oh my goodness. I didn't know I had that many thoughts or memories.